On the afternoon of Saturday, September 6, 1997, 19-year-old Brooke Baker typed furiously on a computer in the journalism department at Vincennes University in the small college town of Vincennes, Indiana. Brooke looked at the words on the screen and she felt a rush of excitement. Writing was her favorite pastime. She was a journalist and editor for the university newspaper, but this felt different because Brooke was writing the most important story she'd ever worked on. She finished writing her opening paragraph, read it over a few times, and then exhaled. This was a great start. And she'd secured a major interview in a few days that she knew would make this story the talk of the entire campus when it was done. Brooke loved the idea of having a story that she wrote be talked about by students and faculty. She was only a sophomore, but she already had clear goals for after graduation. She wanted to move to New York and become a writer for the highly prestigious Rolling Stone magazine. But to make that happen, she really needed experience writing major stories like the one she was working on. But in truth, it wasn't the attention or potential accolades that made Brooke want to become a professional journalist. She believed that good reporting and good writing could really make a difference in the world and that it could genuinely help people who needed help. And so that's why she had chosen to write this story in the first place, and why she was now willing to spend part of her weekend alone in the journalism department working on it. Brooke looked down at her watch and saw it was already 3 p.m., later than she realized. So she put her notes in her backpack and got ready to leave. But before she left, she checked her school email. She opened up the first message, and immediately she felt a pit form in her stomach. Then she glanced all around the room, like she thought maybe somebody was secretly watching her, and then she logged out of her email, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and rushed out of the room. Outside, she saw a young man named Steve Hoffman standing by the door with a huge smile on his face. Brooke had long, light brown hair with blue eyes, and today she was wearing jeans and a baggy t-shirt, and Steve thought she was one of the prettiest girls he'd ever met. They'd gone out a couple of times, and Steve hoped they would start going out more often. Brooke smiled back at Steve and apologized for keeping him waiting. He said it wasn't a big deal, that he'd only been there a couple of minutes, but then Steve noticed the worried look on Brooke's face, and he asked if everything was okay. Brooke said, yep, everything's fine. She was just stressed about the story she was working on. And then before Steve could ask any more questions, she took Steve's arm, and they began walking past all the red brick buildings that lined the campus. It was a warm day, almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and a group of students were reclining nearby on the grass, soaking in the sun. The campus was always calm and beautiful around this time of the year, and just walking outside with Steve relaxed Brooke, and so she put the email she had just read out of her mind. A few minutes later, Brooke and Steve turned away from the center of campus onto a small street that had several fast food restaurants on it. Not far away, they could see a bridge that stretched all the way across the Wabash River and led into the state of Illinois on the other side. Brooke and Steve walked into a sandwich place, grabbed some food, and sat down, and before long they were talking about school and also their shared love of movies. And then at some point, as casually as he could, Steve asked if Brooke maybe wanted to come back to his apartment later that night to watch a movie. He said his roommate was going to be out, so they'd have the place to themselves. Brooke told Steve that did sound fun, but she already had plans. So maybe they could hang out and watch movies next weekend. Steve said that would be great, and then they talked some more and finished up their lunch, and then before long, they left the shop and began heading back to campus. And after walking for a little bit, it was time to part ways, and so Brooke thanked Steve again for lunch, and then she walked past the journalism department building and crossed the street to her house. Brooke had chosen this small white wooden house to live in during her sophomore year because it was so close to the university building where she spent most of her time, the journalism building. She also chose it because she could afford to live there by herself. Brooke loved spending time with people, but she also loved having a quiet place to write without any distractions. But tonight was not going to be one of those nights where she wanted total silence and peace because she wasn't writing. Instead, she was going to a party. And so Brooke went inside her house, she dropped her backpack on the floor, and then headed to her bedroom, where she began digging through her closet and laying out clothes to figure out which outfit she was going to wear for the fun that night. After midnight on September 7th, so about 9 hours after Brooke met Steve for lunch, Brooke danced to the music blaring through a small house located just off campus. The party she was at had been raging for a while, and Brooke was having a great time. She'd been really stressed about the story, and this was a good chance for her to blow off some steam. Brooke grinned at the tall young man dancing next to her, and then she wrapped her arms around his neck. His name was Tommy Williams, and he looked at Brooke just the same way that Steve did. He thought she was totally beautiful. And then Tommy asked if she wanted to get out of there with him. Brooke nodded and said, yeah, let's go back to my place. and so the two of them said their goodbyes to some friends, and then they left together. The two walked for a few minutes through town and then eventually cut across the campus, which was empty except for a couple of other students wandering home after a night out. Brooke and Tommy had just passed the journalism department and had begun to cross the street to Brooke's house when suddenly bright headlights lit up their faces and they stopped walking. Brooke turned and saw a campus police officer sitting in his vehicle on the street. Brooke grabbed Tommy's hand and told him to walk fast. And so the two crossed the street the rest of the way and they approached Brooke's house. But before going in, Tommy asked Brooke, hey, what's going on? It's just a campus cop. He's most likely just out here looking for drunk students. We're okay. We're not going to get in trouble. But Brooke would say that the guy in the vehicle was not just a campus cop. He was also her landlord, and he totally creeped her out. She told Tommy that she'd caught her landlord a few times watching her through her window. And not long ago, she had gotten out of the shower one time and walked out of the bathroom wearing nothing but a towel, and he was just standing there in her apartment. She had screamed at him and asked, what are you doing here? And he said he'd just come to spray the house for bugs. He said it was his right to come in whenever he needed because he was the landlord. Tommy couldn't believe it and said that was totally insane. And he told Brooke that she really should go tell the police, the actual city police, not the campus cops, because this guy sounded legitimately dangerous. Brooke nodded, but said she really just didn't want to talk about it, at least not right then. And so she grabbed her keys out of her purse, but before she could unlock her door, behind them, both she and Tommy heard the sound of another car coming down the road and slowing down basically right behind them, out on the road. But when Brooke and Tommy turned around, the car sped off. Tommy didn't get a good look at the car, and so he just asked Brooke, hey, who was that? Who would be pulling up in front of your house and then speeding off in the middle of the night? Brooke just shook her head. She didn't say anything, but she actually did recognize this second car. It was Steve's. Brooke secretly wondered if maybe Steve had just been waiting by her house on the off chance she might want to go hang out. Or if maybe he had been following her since they ate lunch together that afternoon. And so between the email she got before she left the journalism department, the campus cop parked in front of her house, and now Steve driving and lurking around her house, it had been a really weird day. But still, Brooke was having a good time with Tommy, and she didn't want any of that other stuff to ruin her night. So she opened the door and led Tommy inside. At 9 p.m. that night, so basically 20-ish hours after Brooke and Tommy went inside of Brooke's house, Brooke's brother knocked on Brooke's front door and called out to his sister. The siblings were supposed to have gotten together that afternoon, but Brooke hadn't been home when he came by. Back in 1997, cell phones were not nearly as prominent as they are now, and Brooke and her brother didn't have them. And so Brooke's brother had tried calling her home, her landline phone, a few times throughout the day, but she hadn't answered. And so now he had just come by her house to make sure she was okay. And so the brother knocked on the door one more time and waited a few minutes, but when he didn't hear anything inside and, the door didn't open, finally he just reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and used the house key that Brooke had given him for her place, and he unlocked the front door. Once he stepped inside, he immediately heard the sound of water running in the bathroom. He figured Brooke must be taking a bath or a shower, so he shouted out to let her know that he was there. But again, nobody responded. Brooke's brother walked down a short hallway towards the bathroom, continuing to call out for his sister, but when he got down the hall, he saw the bathroom door was wide open, and so was the shower curtain, and Brooke wasn't in there. He walked into the bathroom and went straight to the bath, and when he did, he was just confused. The water was running in the bath, and several wet towels were laying in the middle of the tub. He turned off the water and then walked out of the bathroom and headed down the hall towards Brooke's bedroom. He knocked but got no response, and so eventually he opened up the door and walked inside, and right away he turned his head, because the lights were on in the bedroom, and his sister was totally naked, asleep in her bed, and part of her body was exposed. And so Brooke's brother immediately said, I'm so sorry, and he shielded his eyes. And as he was standing there, he didn't hear his sister kind of reacting to his presence, and he knew his sister was actually a really heavy sleeper, and so without looking, he sort of walked over with his head turned away and was starting to cover his sister up with a blanket, to keep her warm. But as he did, he stopped, because something just didn't seem right. He's not looking at his sister, but he can hear her, or more specifically, he can't hear her. He can't hear her breathing. So finally, the brother just turned and looked directly at his sister and also the wall above the headboard, and he just started shaking uncontrollably. And then a moment later, he turned, ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Detective Greg Winkler of the Indiana State Police pulled up to Brooke's white wooden house and parked several feet away from the ambulance that was already out front. The town of Vincennes had a really small police department, and so anytime there was a violent crime in the town, the state police were called. But that really didn't happen very often, and when it did happen, these violent crimes almost never occurred near the college campus, and so Winkler had been very surprised when he got this call. He stepped out of his car and looked up and down the street. It was basically empty, and so Winkler was clearly the first cop to have arrived at the scene. So Winkler walked over and introduced himself, and even though it was pretty dark out in front of the house, Winkler could tell the young man had been sobbing. Winkler eventually asked Brooke's brother if he could please explain what had happened. Brooke's brother told the detective that he and his sister were going to meet up that day, but he hadn't been able to get in touch with her, and so that's why he came by her house. Then he told Winkler about how he let himself in with his own key, and then also what he had seen in the bathroom and, of course, in the bedroom. Detective Winkler thanked him and asked him to please keep waiting outside. Then Winkler walked into the house and found paramedics standing by Brooke's bedroom door. They informed him that the young woman had been dead when they arrived. Winkler nodded and walked into the bedroom. He saw Brooke's body laying on the bed, and right away he lowered his head. He was an experienced homicide detective, but that did not make a scene like this any easier to deal with. Winkler could see immediately that there was blood spatter on the wall behind the bed. He got closer to the body, and he saw multiple wounds on Brooke's neck and chest. There was also blood on the sheets, as if she had suffered wounds on her back as well. Then Winkler noticed the bruising on her inner thighs. The detective would have to wait for the forensics team to arrive, but so far, to him, based on what he was seeing, this looked like a violent murder that had followed a sexual assault. Winkler felt angry. The victim was basically still a kid. I mean, one look at the pictures and decorations in her room made that obvious. He walked into the hall, ready to search the rest of the house, but he saw that several local police and state forensics officers had just arrived. One of the Vincennes PD officers was Detective Bob Dunham. The two men greeted each other. They had worked together before, and Winkler turned around and led Dunham into Brooke's room. Dunham looked at the body and the bloodstains on the wall. He had the same thought and felt the same anger as Winkler. Someone most likely had raped this young woman and then viciously killed her. A few minutes later, the detectives left the bedroom and began to search the rest of the house. They started with the bathroom, where those wet towels were laying in the bath. And then after that, they went to the kitchen, and they found the sink filled with water with several knives soaking in it. Durham called out to one of the nearby forensics officers, who then quickly came into the kitchen, and they all agreed at least one of those knives in the sink could be a murder weapon, so the forensics officer bagged up all the knives as evidence. After that, the detectives continued their search of the house, and they didn't find any sign of forced entry, and also they found Brooke's purse and some cash just laying out in the open. So from the looks of it, this didn't seem like a crime connected to a robbery. And not long after the detectives had done this search of the house, the forensics team that was also at the house determined that very likely Brooke had been sexually assaulted before being killed, just like the detectives had thought. The forensics officers also pulled DNA samples from Brooke's body, from under her fingernails, and also from the blood on the wall, and they informed the detectives that they would have further information about what happened to her after processing a rape kit. And so to this point, the detectives felt like they sort of had a good amount of information about what very likely happened here, a rape followed by a murder. A horrible thing, but relatively straightforward. And so the detectives believed they were looking for a man, maybe a current or ex-boyfriend who Brooke knew well enough to let into the house, because again, there was no sign of forced entry. Or if it was not a current or ex-boyfriend, they believed they were still looking for a man, but one who just happened to have his own key to this house. Winkler stepped outside and found Brooke's brother standing with a couple of officers. Winkler walked over to him and asked him to give him a more detailed timeline of exactly where he had been that day and also the night before. And Brooke's brother laid it out for him. When he wasn't trying to track down his sister, he had mostly been hanging out with friends. Now, the police would obviously have to follow up with his friends to confirm his alibi, but for now, they took him at face value, and then Winkler asked the brother if he knew of anybody else, friends, family, anybody, who might have a key to his sister's house. Brooke's brother thought about it and then said he was pretty sure he was the only family member who had a key, and then he also said that he did know Brooke's landlord also had a key. He told Winkler the landlord was a campus cop named Mike Nardine, and he knew that his sister could not stand him. Winkler asked why. Was he just like a bad landlord or something? but Brooke's brother said it was way worse than that. He said Mike used to watch his sister through the windows, and one time he had even let himself into the apartment unannounced. At this point, Brooke's brother looked right at Winkler, and the detective looked back and could see how angry the brother was. And so Winkler, sensing there was more here, asked the brother, is there anything else police needed to know about this landlord guy? And Brooke's brother just nodded. He said he was almost positive her landlord, Mike, had offered to let Brooke keep her rent money in exchange for sex. A couple of days later, Detective Winkler and Dunham met with Mike Nardine, the landlord. Brooke's autopsy report suggested that she had been murdered late at night on September 6th or in the early morning hours of September 7th, and the detectives had learned that Mike, the landlord, was working on campus around that exact time and not far from Brooke's house. Mike walked into the small interview room at the Vincennes Police Department and sat down across from the two detectives, and right away the detectives could tell Mike was angry. He made it very clear that he did not understand why they would drag a fellow officer in for this kind of interrogation. But Winkler and Dunham assured Mike they were just trying to get a clear picture of what had happened. This didn't seem to make Mike any happier, but he did answer the detectives' questions about his relationship with Brooke. He told them that he was her landlord and that they would talk from time to time when he was doing work on her house or collecting the rent. When there was a pause in the conversation, Winkler just asked Mike straight out if he had ever spied on Brooke when she was in her house, or if he had ever told Brooke she could exchange sex for rent. Mike glared at the two detectives. He said none of that happened, and if he ever showed up at the house unannounced, it was just to do work that had to get done. That was it. At this, Dunham spoke up, and he told Mike, okay, that all makes sense, and then Dunham asked if Mike would submit to a polygraph test and also provide a DNA sample. After all, if Mike was telling the truth, DNA and a polygraph were the easiest ways to prove that. Mike continued to just glare at the two detectives, but he agreed to both requests. And so Dunham and Winkler excused themselves and walked out of the room, and they quickly arranged for the polygraph test and also sent an officer into the room to swab Mike's cheek for the DNA sample. And a little while later that day, after Mike had taken the polygraph, the detectives thanked him for coming in and told him they would follow up if they needed to. Mike just shook his head and walked out of the room. Once he was gone, Winkler and Dunham joined the polygraph examiner, and the examiner reviewed Mike's test right in front of them, and he told the detectives that the results were inconclusive, which meant there was definitely a chance that Mike had lied on several questions, namely about his relationship with Brooke. Investigators knew it was going to take some time to get the test results back for Mike's DNA sample, as well as the DNA samples that were taken from the crime scene. So while they waited, they spent the next several days interviewing Brooke's friends and family to try to get as much information about the college sophomore as possible. And during these interviews, several people vouched for Brooke's brother's whereabouts on the night and early morning when his sister's murder had supposedly taken place. And so Winkler and Dunham did not consider him to be a primary suspect. But just about all of Brooke's friends told the detectives that there were two guys that Brooke had been seeing, Steve Hoffman and Tommy Williams, and she had hung out with both of them on the day before she was found dead. Winkler and Dunham brought Steve into the station first, and after he sat down, Steve kept fumbling with his hands and running his hands through his hair. It was obvious the kid was nervous. But the detectives didn't think that was very suspicious because, after all, he was young and he had just been thrown right into the middle of a murder investigation. Winkler spoke calmly to Steve. He said Steve was not in any trouble, but they needed him to be completely honest with them, even if whatever he had to say might be embarrassing or might make him feel like he was betraying Brooke's trust. Steve nodded and said he would tell them whatever they needed to know. So Winkler started by asking how long Steve and Brooke had been together. But right away, Steve said he and Brooke weren't really dating, they were just friends with benefits. They had started hanging out with each other recently, and they had had sex a few times, but Steve said he really liked Brooke, and he really hoped that their relationship would become more serious over time. Then Dunham asked point blank if Steve had slept with Brooke that past weekend, but Steve said no, he hadn't. He said he met Brooke for lunch on Saturday and asked if she wanted to meet up later that night at his place, but she said she already had plans. After a pause, Dunham leaned in and asked Steve if his lunch date with Brooke was actually the last time he had seen Brooke. And at this question, Steve sort of froze and began to stammer like he couldn't make a sentence. But then he finally said, after their lunch, he had just gone back to his apartment and his roommate, Brian Jones, could vouch for him. Dunham nodded and asked if he and his roommate Brian were both at the apartment the whole day. But Steve said that Brian had gone out later that night, so Steve at one point was at the apartment just by himself. And at this point, Dunham just said, okay, take a deep breath, and I want you to answer the original question. Was lunch the last time you saw Brooke? At this, Steve shook his head, and his face turned bright red like he was totally embarrassed. And he told the detectives that on the night after he and Brooke had gotten lunch together, he had driven to her house and actually parked his car nearby. He knew she had gone out that night, but he thought maybe when she got home, she might want to hang out with him. But around maybe 1 a.m. or so, he saw Brooke walk up to her door with another guy. And when he saw this, he felt this immediate rush of jealousy and anger, and for a second he drove right up in front of her house and then sped off down the street. Dunham and Winkler looked at each other as if they kind of knew that this was a big moment in the interview. And then Winkler turned back towards Steve and leaned in, and he asked if Steve had been angry enough about seeing this other guy to maybe go back to Brooke's house later to confront Brooke about the other guy. Maybe they got into a fight. Maybe things got out of control. At this point, Steve began to get visibly upset. He said he never went back to the house, he really liked Brooke, and he would never hurt her. He had just been stupid and jealous, and that was really it. The detectives let Steve collect himself, and then after a few moments, Dunham asked him if he would provide a DNA sample. And at this, Steve did not hesitate. He said he would do whatever they needed if it would help them find Brooke's killer. Later that week, Winkler and Dunham met with Tommy, the other guy that Brooke was seeing before she was killed, and the interview went pretty much the same way the interview with Steve had gone. Tommy said he and Brooke periodically went out together, and yes, they had slept with each other a few times, but they were not in a serious relationship. Tommy said he and Brooke had been at a party together that Saturday night, then they had gone to her house and they had had sex. He said he left not long afterwards, maybe sometime around 1:30 in the morning, and then he walked around campus for a while and eventually ended up going to his friend's apartment and crashing on his couch. Now, this part of Tommy's story did jump out at the detectives. Tommy could be telling the truth here, but there was a gap of time when nobody would have seen him, so he had no alibi. And that was more than enough time for him to murder Brooke, dump those towels in the bath, put the murder weapon in the sink, clean himself up, and then head to his friend's place. And so the detectives asked Tommy to submit a DNA sample, and he said he would. And then after Tommy had given that sample, the detectives told him that he could go, but that he needed to stay in town. A few weeks into the investigation, the DNA test results from the crime scene and also the results from the rape kit came in, and both provided a DNA sample that the crime lab believed belonged to Brooke's killer. But soon after that, DNA test results came in for Brooke's landlord Mike and from the two guys Brooke had been seeing, Steve and Tommy, but none of their DNA was a clear match to the samples taken from Brooke's body and the crime scene. Now, this did not necessarily mean that, now Mike, Steve, and Tommy are all innocent, but it did mean that police did not have the kind of scientific evidence that would hold up in court. So investigators didn't feel like they had enough to arrest any of their top 3 suspects. And these test results felt like a major setback for Winkler and Dunham. They had become convinced that one of the DNA samples they had secured would match the killer's. And so now they had to totally refocus their investigation and start looking for potential leads that maybe they had overlooked. And as is often the case when a terrible crime takes place in a small community, police began getting lots of pressure from local media, city leaders, and Brooke's friends and family to solve this case quickly. At around this time, Winkler and Dunham made their way across the university campus towards the journalism department. It was hard for them to describe, but even the campus felt like it was full of tension from this case. Like nobody could relax because they feared they might be the next victim because whoever did this had not been caught yet. The detectives entered the journalism department, walked down a long hallway lit with bright fluorescent lights, and found their way to a small office that was cluttered with books. In the office was one of Brooke's journalism professors, who also served as Brooke's advisor, and she welcomed Winkler and Dunham, and then she sat down at her desk. The detectives thanked her for meeting with them, and then Winkler got right into it. He asked her if she knew of any rivalries between Brooke and maybe other journalism students. He told the professor that at this point, the police were looking for anything that might point them in the right direction. Brooke's professor said nothing like that was going on, at least nothing that she was aware of. She said Brooke was very friendly and outgoing and was able to get along with pretty much everyone. She was even one of those rare students who didn't fall into a specific clique and who had friends from all different groups on campus. But then the professor stopped and lowered her voice, and with a very serious look, she told the detectives that actually there might be one group of students that the police should look into. The professor said right before Brooke was killed, she had been working on a story that was going to make a lot of people angry. She was covering an alleged rape that had taken place during a frat party right out on the steps in the front of the frat house. Brooke was set to interview the young woman who was accusing the fraternity brothers, but Brooke had died just days before that interview was going to happen. At this, Winkler and Dunham shot each other a look. This was not anything that Brooke's friends had mentioned. So the detectives got as much information about the story and the fraternity as they could. Then they thanked the professor again, left the campus, and then arranged to search Brooke's phone records and emails. And as they were conducting the search, they quickly discovered Brooke had been receiving threatening emails from members of this fraternity the entire time she'd been working on the story. And one of those emails simply read, "Write the story and you will die." This new lead initially gave a huge jolt to the investigation. Over the next few weeks, police tracked down the members of the fraternity who were directly connected to the story Brooke had been writing, and they secured DNA samples from 10 of these young men, and they interviewed a number of students who had actually been at the frat party in question. However, when the DNA test results came back from the frat brothers, none of them matched the killer's DNA sample. This left Detectives Winkler and Dunham almost at a complete loss. Lead after lead had fallen apart, and it was starting to look like maybe Brooke's killer just had no clear connection to her at all. Over the next several months, the detectives continued to search for new evidence and new leads, but nothing of use surfaced. And eventually, the Vincennes Police Department determined that they didn't have the resources to continue their full-time investigation. So Detective Dunham was pulled away to work on other cases. And then finally, after a year had gone by and still there was no more traction on the case, the Indiana State Police determined that Brooke's murder was now officially a cold case. On July 5th, 1999, almost 2 years after Brooke's murder, Detective Winkler sat at his desk looking over cases that had come in during the July 4th holiday. The phone rang and Winkler answered. Detective Dunham was on the other line, and he was talking so fast, Winkler almost couldn't understand him. But Dunham eventually slowed down and said he was at an apartment in town following up on a missing persons call, and Winkler needed to get there right now. And so Winkler, who trusted Dunham, he hung up, got in his car, and sped across town. Winkler found Dunham waiting for him outside the apartment complex, and then as soon as Winkler got out, Dunham quickly led him into the apartment and right to the bathroom. And Winkler almost could not believe what he was seeing. A pile of wet towels were right there in the middle of the tub, and Dunham told Winkler the bathwater had been running when police arrived at the scene. Then Dunham led Winkler to the kitchen, and the sink was filled with water, and knives were soaking in it. Next, they went to the bedroom, and Dunham showed Winkler the bloodstains on the wall. The crime scene looked almost identical to the scene at Brooke's house, except for one major difference. The Vincennes University sophomore who lived there, Erica Norman, was nowhere to be found. Investigators thought there was still a chance Erica was alive, and so they quickly coordinated with local and state police right across the Wabash River in Illinois, and they launched a 2-state search for her. But 15 days later, on July 20th, 1999, police would find Erica, but she was deceased. Her body was found abandoned in a field on the Illinois side of the river. Back in Indiana, Winkler and Dunham met with several of Erica's friends, and one of them told the detectives that the night Erica had gone missing, she had gone home to watch movies with a guy she knew from work. And when Erica's friend told them who this guy was, the detectives felt a rush of adrenaline, but they also felt a huge sense of regret. They recognized the name, and so now they were nearly certain who had killed both Erica Norman and Brooke Baker. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted over a 2-year period, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Brooke Baker in the early morning hours of September 7th, 1997. The killer sat on the couch next to Brooke. The pair was watching TV, but at some point, Brooke said she was tired and just wanted to go to bed. However, as Brooke began to get up to leave, the killer turned and grabbed her by the arm and pulled her in to kiss her. Brooke shied away and said she didn't want to do that, but the killer just jumped on top of her and then tried to take her clothes off. Immediately, Brooke tried to fight him off, and she slashed the killer's face with her fingernails, and the killer was so stunned by it, he kind of sat up for a second, at which point Brooke managed to jump up from underneath him off the couch, and she ran down the hall. But the killer just ran right after her. He caught up to her, grabbed her from behind, and shoved her into the nearest bedroom. He forced Brooke onto the bed, ripped off her clothes, and then sexually assaulted her. The whole time, Brooke tried to fight back, but she couldn't break free. And then at some point, the killer, who was on top of her, grabbed her by the throat and started choking her. Brooke coughed and wheezed and tried to get air, but the killer kept choking her tighter and tighter until Brooke began to lose consciousness. But the killer let go and climbed off the bed. Brooke was still breathing, but she could barely move. And so the killer ran out of the room, went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife in the sink, and then ran back to the bedroom. Brooke saw her killer rushing back into the room with the knife, and so she used the little strength she had left to turn over on her side and try to pull herself up and out of the bed, but the killer just leapt on top of her again, and he slammed the knife over and over and over again into Brooke's back, stabbing her a total of 11 times. As the killer did this, blood sprayed on the wall, the sheets, and the killer's hands and clothes, and when the killer was done, they climbed off of Brooke and rolled her onto her back. They weren't sure, but they thought Brooke was still breathing. So they raised the knife and stabbed her in the chest. Now, the killer was sure she was dead. The killer climbed off the bed and stood in the bedroom, breathing heavily and trying to collect their thoughts. Finally, they walked out and went to the bathroom. They put the knife down, grabbed a few towels, and tried to wipe the blood off themselves. Then they threw the towels into the tub and turned on the water. Then they picked up the murder weapon, the knife, and went to the kitchen. They filled the sink up with water and then dropped the knife in it to soak. Then the killer walked through the apartment, turned off the TV, then walked to the front door. They opened it up and locked the handle from the inside, and then poked their head out, kind of scanning the street. And when everything looked clear, the killer casually stepped outside, closing the now locked door behind them, and then they took off running across campus back to their apartment. It would turn out Brooke had known her killer well enough to let them into her house, just as investigators had suspected. But the killer was not one of the young men Brooke was seeing. It was actually one of their roommates. At the time of Brooke's murder, Brian Jones had lived with Steve, the guy who met Brooke for lunch and hoped to, at some point, have a more serious relationship with her. And so Brian had met Brooke a few times when she had come by the apartment to see Steve, and, they had gotten along well because Brooke got along with basically everybody. But Brooke had no idea that in those sparse interactions she had with him, Brian had developed an obsession with her. And so on the night that Brooke would be murdered, Brian went out and just kept thinking about her. And when he showed up at her house later that night, he was determined to have sex with her, whether she wanted to or not. And when Brooke denied him, Brian raped and then murdered her. Brian's name had come up in Brooke's murder investigation, but only in passing. And after 2 years went by, it looked like he would get away with his horrific crime. But then Brian had become obsessed with Erica Norman, another Vincennes University sophomore who had light brown hair and light eyes. Brian knew Erica from work, and just like he had done with Brooke, he decided he was going to have sex with her no matter what. And on that night in July of 1999, he went to Erica's place to watch movies, but then just assaulted and murdered her almost identically to how he had done it 2 years earlier at Brooke's house. In fact, putting the towels in the bath and soaking the knife in the sink was something Brian had seen in a movie and imitated. But this time with Erica, he moved her body to a field across the border in Illinois, thinking that would help distance himself from the crime. But one of Erica's friends knew that Brian had gone to Erica's house on the night she disappeared. And so when Detectives Winkler and Dunham tracked Brian down, they convinced him to provide a DNA sample, and when the results came back, investigators finally got their match to Brooke's killer's DNA. Brian was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years without chance for parole. To honor Brooke's love of writing and her belief that journalists could change the world, the Indiana Collegiate Press Association established the Brooke Baker Indiana Collegiate Journalist of the Year Award, and it continues to inspire young journalists to use their work to help others. In 1932, Charlie Pollard was a 26-year-old farmer living in Macon County, Alabama, where 82% of the population at the time was African American, and they were all forced to live under the rules of a strictly segregated society. At the time, the United States was just beginning to crawl out of the Great Depression that had started 3 years earlier, but you wouldn't know it riding through Charlie's town. Like Charlie, many of the other residents in Macon County were completely dirt poor, and they lived in these wooden shacks with no screens on their windows, there was no furniture inside, and they would just throw some dirty rags on the ground to sleep on. On average, the men in the town that were lucky enough to have a job made less than $1 per day. So when Charlie heard a rumor that the government was going to be coming to town and giving free medical exams to all the African American men, Charlie was thrilled. He had never been to a doctor before, and he certainly wasn't going to turn down a free visit to one. And so a couple of days later, the rumor turned out to be true when a government health service worker showed up in their town and set up shop in their one-room schoolhouse. Charlie got in line with the hundreds of other men from Macon County, and then by mid-morning it was his turn, and the health service worker told him that today they were just going to be doing a blood test. And so Charlie eagerly rolled up his sleeve and stuck his arm out. A couple of days later, the results from the blood test had come in, and Charlie was informed that he had bad blood. Bad blood was a commonly used term in that area at the time to describe a wide array of ailments. The worker didn't get into specifics about what Charlie's diagnosis meant. They just told him that in virtue of his diagnosis of bad blood, he was now eligible to join a government-sponsored medical treatment program. If he agreed to be a part of it, he would not only receive medical care for his bad blood, he would also receive free rides to and from the health clinic, he would get a free hot meal on examination days, and in the event he died during the program, his family would be given $50 if they allowed the doctors to perform a thorough autopsy on his body before they buried him. Despite not really understanding what it meant to have bad blood, Charlie decided to join the program, mostly because of those free meals and because he had a deep trust and respect of the government. And Charlie wasn't alone. About 400 other African American men from Macon County agreed to be a part of the program as well. At first, the program was everything they promised it would be. It was just a couple of low-key medical examinations with a nice hot meal, and then occasionally they would take some pills and have another blood draw. But eventually they started being given regular, excruciatingly painful spinal taps that would leave them bedridden for weeks afterwards. But despite this painful and surprising turn of events that none of the men saw coming, they were not aware they would be getting spinal taps as part of this program. Charlie and the other men were convinced this program was still in their best interest and that they could trust the government to eventually cure them of their bad blood. And so Charlie and the other men didn't resist the spinal taps or other follow-on painful and bizarre medical procedures that they were being told was good for them and would help them get rid of this bad blood. Less than a year later, men in this program began getting sick. They started developing rashes and sores all over their body. Their bones and joints would ache. They began losing hair. They had indigestion. They had headaches. They had constant fevers. And for some of the men, these symptoms would eventually subside. But for others, they got dramatically worse. For those men, they would develop tumors and their bones would start to disintegrate. They would go blind or deaf or become paralyzed, or they would simply die. But despite the obvious ineffectiveness of this treatment program, it persisted. When America entered World War II in 1941, Charlie and many of the other men in this program wanted to enlist in the military and go join the fight. But when they went to enlist, they were told that as members of this special medical program, they could only receive treatment from the doctors in that program. And so they could not receive treatment from military doctors and therefore were disqualified from military service. While frustrated by this rule, Charlie and many of the other men still considered themselves to be very fortunate to be allowed to be a part of this program that was curing them of their bad blood. And Charlie specifically felt like he was one of the luckiest men inside of this program because his bad blood had not led to these terrible symptoms that his friends were experiencing. And so over the years, in between his medical appointments, Charlie got married, he had a child, he even managed to buy a little plot of land that he farmed on nearly year-round. Then, in 1973, so over 40 years after they began this medical program, Charlie and the other survivors of this program had their lives completely turned upside down. That year, a very junior assistant within the Public Health Service secretly mailed off all of the records of this Macon County medical program to the Associated Press. And then a couple of days later, the Washington Star newspaper ran this huge story on their front page that said syphilis victims in United States study went untreated for 40 years. It would turn out Charlie and the other 400 men in this medical program, they didn't have bad blood. That was just kind of a made-up term to get them not to ask any questions. What they had was syphilis, a deadly disease that ravages the human body in 3 stages that can unfold over a lifetime. And so these doctors that treated Charlie were not actually treating him. They knew he had syphilis. That was why he was even part of the program to begin with. When they tested his blood, they were trying to see who had syphilis in Macon County, and then they took those people and they entered them into this phony program, not to make them better, because this was not a treatment program. It was a US government-backed medical study of what happens to African American men with syphilis if their condition goes completely untreated for their entire lives. The leaders of the study did not care what happened to these men. And that point was made crystal clear when in the 1940s, a cure for syphilis was discovered, penicillin. But instead of giving it to these men and saving their lives, they intentionally hid the cure from them and prevented them from getting it. This is why these men were not allowed to enlist in the military or seek outside medical care, because those doctors would discover these men had syphilis and they would just give them penicillin, curing them, but that screwed up the study, and so they couldn't have that. The Public Health Service chose Macon County, Alabama, because at the time, 35% of the population was already infected with syphilis. And because they knew the men in this town would be largely uneducated and poor and desperate, and therefore easy to trick into joining this highly unethical study. At least 28 men in the study died as a result of their syphilis infections, and countless others suffered from long-term side effects. Charlie was 66 years old when he heard the news. Finally, he had an answer. Bad blood meant he had syphilis, but fortunately his syphilis had either burned out or gone dormant. But he thought about all the other men in the study that had not been as lucky, and Charlie felt so betrayed by the government. He and the rest of the men had no idea they were getting taken advantage of. Charlie got in touch with a lawyer who eventually sued the federal government, and in an out-of-court settlement, Charlie and the other 73 survivors of the so-called Tuskegee experiment were given $38,000 each as compensation. After the settlement, Charlie just went back to his simple life in Macon County, and then 27 years later, on April 29, 2000, Charlie passed away at the age of 94. Our next story is called Suspended. On the evening of March 15th, 2018, a 55-year-old man named Jian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians jumped back to get out of the way, and a woman in high heels and a beautiful fancy dress mumbled something insulting about how drunk Jian must be. But Jian was not drunk. He was totally sober, and now he was absolutely mortified. Jian was actually a businessman who was attempting to impress his clients at dinner, but as he had been sitting at the table with his clients, he had started to feel this pressure in his chest that became so intense that at some point he just had to get up and run outside and vomit. And so after Jian had stood up and wiped his mouth, he thought, now that he had been sick and thrown up, that he would feel better. But as he was standing there, he noticed the pressure in his chest had not been relieved at all. And so, as much as Jian wanted to stick around and talk more with his clients, he felt like the only thing he could do now was to go in and politely excuse himself for the rest of the night and just go home and sleep off whatever was going on with him. But when Jian went back into the restaurant and was actually back at his table, before he could even say a sentence to his clients explaining the situation, he was turning around and running back outside and vomiting on the street again. At this point, Jian knew something was definitely wrong. And so he didn't have time to tell his clients what was going on. He just needed to get to a hospital. And so he sprinted across the street, got in his car, and began driving. When he got to the hospital, he was so scared about what was happening to him that he actually parked his car crooked in the spot and left his door open as he sprinted towards the emergency room. And then once he was inside the hospital, he ran up to the receptionist and tried to tell them what was going on, but he literally couldn't speak, and then he just collapsed in a chair right nearby. Now, the hospital was extremely busy, but all the nurses could tell whatever was going on with this man, it could not wait. And so they ran over to him, they lifted him up, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him into a private exam room. And then once he was in there, they began taking his vitals, and also they began assessing him, looking for some sort of trauma on the outside of his body that could explain what was going on with him, but they couldn't find anything. And so after they were sure that Gian was stable, he was breathing okay, his heart rate was okay, he just couldn't speak, but he was going to be okay, the team decided that the next thing they should do would be to give him a CT scan. A CT scan is a specialized type of imaging that can show what's going on inside someone's body. It's like a really detailed X-ray. And after they gave Gian a CT scan, his results were baffling. There was this solid, fairly large, white object that was lodged at the base of Gian's esophagus. Your esophagus sits below your throat and above your stomach. It's basically the tube that food goes through to get to your stomach. But whatever was stuck inside of Gian's esophagus was not something that looked like food. It actually kind of looked like a human hand. Now, the doctors had no idea what this thing was, and you gotta remember that they really don't have much information here. All they know is this middle-aged guy who's dressed really well has come running into the hospital, he can't speak, and he's collapsed. And here we are, he has this obstruction in his esophagus. And so even though the doctors really had no idea what they were dealing with, what they knew is they had to get this foreign object out of Gian. So they wheeled Gian into the operating room for emergency surgery, and then at some point a doctor came in with this long skinny tube that had a camera at the top of it. Their first step for this operation was putting this camera down into Gian to see what this thing was that was stuck inside of his esophagus. And so after Gian was prepped for surgery, the doctor with this camera began snaking it down Gian's throat until finally the camera could actually see this white object in his esophagus. And when the camera revealed what this thing was, the entire medical team in the operating room just gasped. They could not believe what they were looking at. To understand what they were looking at, we have to go back several hours. That night, Gian had decided he really wanted to impress his wealthy clients. And so he had decided to take them to this very special restaurant that none of them had been to, and he wanted them to try a very special and very rare dish that this restaurant sold. It was called sanakji. Sanakji is a Korean delicacy that is very popular in certain circles, but it's also very dangerous. Every year in South Korea, at least 6 people die from eating sanakji. Because sanakji is just a living octopus. You literally eat the octopus as it's moving around, and the risk of it getting stuck in your throat is pretty high. And so as Gian is trying to eat this living octopus, the octopus decided it didn't want to be eaten, and so it flailed its tentacles around, and finally its suckers lodged onto his esophagus, and that's where it stopped. Now, we don't know how long this octopus remained alive inside of Gian's esophagus, but we know it was alive at least for a little bit, because after Gian managed to swallow it down, it kept wriggling around and grabbing and trying to escape, and that's what created that intense pressure in Gian's chest and kept causing him to go vomit. And so when the doctors put that camera down Gian's throat, they saw a whole octopus. The octopus was removed from Gian's esophagus, and 2 days later, Gian was discharged, fully recovered. It's unclear if Gian ever tried sanakji again. The next and final story of today's episode is called Earworm. On the night of May 29th, 2007, a 29-year-old man named Romy Baligula sang to himself as he and a big group of his friends wandered into a karaoke bar in the city of San Mateo in the Philippines. Life had not been easy lately for Romy, but tonight he was feeling good. He and his buddies had begun drinking alcohol about an hour earlier, and so he already had a nice buzz as he walked into this bar. He had a brand new shirt on, and for the first time in weeks, Romy actually had money in his pocket. Romy had lost his job a couple of months earlier, and since then, he had not been able to find new employment. And so this city he was living in, San Mateo, even though it was one of the wealthiest places in all of the Philippines, it was also known as a place that had lots of poverty and really no safety net for people that fall on hard times. And so if you lose your job, like Romy had, you could find yourself out on the streets really quickly looking for scrap metal to sell and dumpster diving just to find your next meal. And that's exactly what Romy had been doing for the better part of the last 2 months. He had been living out on the streets. But just a day earlier, he had discovered this stash of very valuable scrap metal, and he had sold it that day for a nice profit. And with that money, he had bought a nice big dinner, a brand new shirt, and tonight he had bought a night out. And the best kind of night out for Romy was going to a karaoke bar. Because Romy loved to sing, and his friends did too, but Romy sang basically all the time. Whether he was full-time employed, making lots of money, enjoying life, or if he was in a dumpster looking for food to eat, Romy would be singing. Now, Romy was not the best singer, certainly not compared to some of his friends who were excellent singers, but he felt like the more he sang, the better he got. And he was kind of proud that he felt like he was progressing and becoming a better and better singer. And Romy's favorite songs to sing were these big ballads. He just loved to close his eyes and let the words of the story kind of take him away. It really was his escape. It was like no matter how bad his life got, he could always sing and that would make him feel better. Once Romy and his friends went inside the karaoke bar, they made their way across the very crowded space to the far side of the bar. They found 2 unoccupied tables, they pushed them together, they all sat down, and then they ordered a round of beers. And then after the beers came, the friends all did a toast to their wonderful night out they were having, and then one by one, each of Romy's friends began getting up and making their way over to the karaoke machine and began going through all the music and deciding which songs they were going to sing that night. One of Romy's friends chose an American country song, another one of his friends chose a pop song from the 1980s about unrequited love. But regardless of the songs that any of Romy's friends chose, when they began getting up there and singing their song, it was like the karaoke bar came alive. People in the Philippines love karaoke. It's really a part of the culture. In fact, many people in the Philippines have a karaoke machine of their own in their house. And so what that means is in karaoke bars like the one Romy was at, the crowd is both really appreciative of good singers who go up there and do karaoke really well, and everyone will get up and cheer and dance along. And then also, if there are bad karaoke singers, the crowd is just as quick to begin jeering and booing at them and getting them to stop. And Romy knew that when he went up on stage that night, he was taking a bit of a risk, because when he went up and identified the song that he was going to sing, he knew it was a questionable choice. But he was confident in his abilities. He had been singing and practicing. He really felt like he was ready to nail this really challenging song, and the crowd was going to love him for it. As Romy sat at the table watching one of his friends perform a fast-paced song about a race car, the bar's bouncer, a 43-year-old man named Robalito Ortega, came over to Romy's table with a big grin on his face. Robalito didn't recognize Romy or his friends. They were new at this bar, and so Robalito wanted to introduce himself and get to know these people. One, because Robalito was a big karaoke enthusiast, just like everybody else was. And two, Robalito felt like it was easier to keep the peace in this bar when everybody knew him and he knew everybody. And so Romy and his friends, they chatted happily with Robalito, and then after Romy's friend, who was singing the song about the race car, wrapped up and came down off the stage, Robalito gave him a nice congratulatory pat on the back and told the friend he did a great job up there. And the friend, in turn, turned around and flagged down the bartender at the other side of the bar and kind of gestured, "Hey, we want another round of drinks." And the friend also made it clear that he wanted to give a drink to the bouncer as well, as like a thank you to the bouncer for giving him the compliment. And the bouncer said, "Thank you very much." And then before long, the beers arrived, and Romy and his friends and the bouncer, they all cheersed and toasted the night and enjoyed their drinks together. And then just a couple of minutes later, it was Romy's turn to take the stage. And so he got up and, as confidently as he could, kind of jogged up onto the stage, and he took the microphone and he looked out at the crowd. And everybody's having a great time. It seemed like the mood was really positive, and Romy really felt like, again, even though this song was a questionable song choice, that this crowd was going to love it and that he was going to do a wonderful job. But when the song began to play in the background, Romy noticed that right away, the mood in the bar completely shifted. It went from loud, happy, and talkative to almost silent as everybody in the bar turned and looked up at the person who had chosen this song. But Romy had anticipated this, and he knew as soon as he actually began singing this song that he could win them over. He was going to nail this song. And sure enough, Romy began to sing, and right away it was like the mood began to kind of return to what it was. People in the audience could tell that Romy was doing a good job, and so about a third of the way into his song, Romy noticed that the bar was basically back to normal. He even looked over and saw the bouncer, who was still standing with his friends over at the table, had raised his beer, kind of saying, "Keep it up, you're doing great." And when Romy saw the bouncer really getting into it, Romy had this surge of adrenaline, and suddenly he felt so confident that he really leaned into the song. And so he began dancing on stage and really belting out each of the lines of the song. But at some point in the song, there's this moment where the singer really needs to hit a high note, and when Romy very confidently attempted to hit this high note, his voice cracked, and it was a really loud, like obvious cracking of his voice, and it kind of threw Romy off rhythm, and he couldn't really get back on rhythm, and so right away the audience reacted by going quiet again and looking angrily up at Romy like, "We knew you were going to screw this up, this was a bad choice," and Romy actually looked over and saw the bouncer. And now the bouncer had his beard down and he's glaring angrily at Romy like, "What are you doing?" But Romy, even though he was kind of faltering here, he did his best to kind of regain his composure because he knew he had practiced this song so many times. He knew he could do it, and he tried so hard to get back on track, but he just couldn't do it. And it was around this point that he looked back at Robolito, the bouncer. And all he would have seen is Robolito angrily belting out the words of this song, almost like he was trying to override how badly Romy was singing it. And then at some point, as Romy is staring at Robolito, Robolito, while singing this song, pulls out a gun, aims it at Romy, and fires. In the Philippines, there is one song that everybody knows you do not sing. In fact, this song is often banned in most karaoke bars, and then even when it's not banned, nobody sings it. And the reason this song is so forbidden is because since 1998, people have begun being murdered for singing it. Reasons unknown, but it just keeps on happening. Since 1998, 12 people have been murdered either while they were singing this song for karaoke or immediately after it. The forbidden song is called My Way by Frank Sinatra, and that was the song that Romy chose. Now, no one really understands why this song somehow elicits all this violence in people in karaoke bars in the Philippines, but it does. Some have said that the message of the song, which is about a man being a man and doing it his way, kind of brings out a lot of masculine energy amongst people that are listening to it, and it can apparently prompt people to just suddenly start acting violent. But that's just a theory. No one really understands why this song just keeps leading to murders. But on May 29th, 2007, when Romy sang this song, Robolito the bouncer, who liked Romy and liked his friends and was having a nice drink with them, he just couldn't handle it when the song was getting butchered, and he hated the song to begin with, and in fact, ironically, Robolito had been hired by that karaoke bar specifically to keep the peace if the song were to come on, but as he listened to this song, something happened inside of him, and he pulled his gun and shot and killed Romy. A couple weeks before Thanksgiving in 2015, a woman named Cicely Odom Rose made her way along the buffet line of a holiday potluck party, loading up her plate with a little bit of everything. Once it was full, she carried it across the room to her 15-year-old daughter, Kennedy. Cicely and her daughter were best friends, and they bonded over their shared loves. like parties, their tight-knit family in Memphis, and of course, great home-cooked food. But when Cicely handed the plate of food to her daughter, Kennedy sort of waved the plate away, pointing at her jaw. Kennedy had just gotten her braces tightened the day before, and apparently they still hurt too much for her to chew. It would turn out both Kennedy and her mother, Cicely, had both gotten braces on their teeth at the same time back in February, but their dental journeys since then had been very different. Cicely didn't really mind or even notice the braces very much, but Kennedy found hers totally aggravating, and every time hers were tightened, she'd be in pain for days. Cicely handed Kennedy's plate of food to a family friend and then took a seat next to her daughter. Cicely could see on Kennedy's face how disappointed she was. This annual family party was something she looked forward to every year. And so Cicely gave Kennedy a big hug and promised her she would feel better soon. Early the next morning, Cicely awoke to Kennedy knocking on her bedroom door. And when her daughter opened the door, she looked exhausted, and she told Cicely that she actually had barely slept all night because her head was throbbing so badly. Cicely grabbed a bottle of aspirin from her bedside table, shook a few pills into her hand, and gave them to Kennedy. Cicely told her daughter to take the pills and go back to bed. A little pain relief and rest could cure anything. But a couple of hours later, when Cicely poked her head into her daughter's room, she found Kennedy curled on her side with a pillow over her head, and she would tell her mother that the pills hadn't helped and her headache was still pounding. Cicely walked over to her daughter and placed the back of her hand against Kennedy's forehead to see if she was burning up. And she did feel slightly warm, but Cicely was now suddenly more worried about Kennedy's lips. They looked swollen and inflamed. She wondered if Kennedy might have caught some sort of bug or rash at the party. Cicely got an ice pack from the freezer, wrapped it in a towel, and had Kennedy hold it to her lips to try to reduce the swelling. Then she brought Kennedy some more aspirin and also fluffed up her pillows. But as she stood to leave, Cicely's heart broke to see her daughter in so much obvious discomfort. And so she made a mental note to plan something fun for Kennedy as soon as she was better. But the next morning, Kennedy had not improved at all. Cicely found her curled up in a fetal position under the covers, looking even weaker and more haggard after another bad night's sleep. Kennedy told her mother that in addition to all these symptoms she was feeling, that at some point in the previous night, her throat had also started to hurt, and now there was a stabbing pain every time she swallowed. And so at this point, Cicely decided enough was enough. She helped Kennedy get dressed and then guided her out to the car and drove her to the nearest clinic. After being shown to an exam room, a nurse gave Kennedy a checkup and swabbed her throat to run some tests. And while they waited, Cicely held her daughter close to her chest and rocked her back and forth, just like she had when she was a little girl. Cicely couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her daughter this sick. I mean, her daughter looked hollowed out and wrecked. Cicely could tell that, whatever this was, it couldn't be normal. Finally, there was a knock at the door, and Kennedy's doctor came inside, and he told them he had good and bad news. The bad news was that Kennedy had caught a bacterial infection called strep throat, which is very painful. It's like the worst sore throat you can get. But the good news was that if Kennedy took a few days of antibiotics, she would bounce right back. And so the doctor scribbled out a prescription, handed it to Cicely, and then told Kennedy she would feel better soon. But just a few days later, Cicely's car came to a stop in front of a hospital, and then she and her daughter went inside of the ER. Cicely told the doctor on duty about Kennedy's strep throat diagnosis and how she had been taking antibiotics for a few days without any signs of improvement. Then suddenly this morning, things went south. Kennedy woke up vomiting from pain, and sores had broken out all over the inside of her mouth. The doctor nodded and asked Kennedy to open up her mouth. And after she had, the doctor used a tongue depressor and flashlight and began examining the walls of her mouth and all around her tongue. Kennedy whimpered at the touch, and then eventually, at the end of the examination, the doctor swabbed one of Kennedy's sores and handed the sample to a nurse who took it to the lab. And then the doctor walked out of the exam room, leaving the mother and daughter alone. As Cicely stood behind Kennedy stroking her hair, she wondered if the sores in her daughter's mouth might be some sort of complication from the antibiotics. Kennedy had never been allergic to medication as a child, but she knew that sometimes allergies don't develop until later in life. Either way, Cicely felt confident that the hospital would figure out what was going on with her daughter, and they would get her started on the right treatment. Eventually, the doctor returned, and he told Cicely that Kennedy was still testing positive for strep throat. However, her strep infection had nothing to do with the sores. He said that, most likely the sores were being caused by some sort of virus, but he wouldn't know for sure until they ran more tests. In the meantime, the doctor told Cicely that he wanted to rule out more serious possibilities, namely Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a rare but sometimes deadly skin disease. At hearing this, Cicely felt blindsided. She didn't understand how an ordinary case of strep throat could have anything to do with this potentially fatal condition the doctor was talking about. Cicely tried to keep her composure for her daughter's sake, but it was hard to act calm with news like this. Once the doctor left the room again, Cicely whipped out her phone and called Kennedy's godmother, Tamara. Tamara had always been a rock for Cicely's family. She was one of those people who just always seemed to know what to do in stressful situations. And so Cicely gripped her daughter's hand tightly as she explained to Tamara everything that had happened over the past few days. She told Tamara that she and Kennedy really needed her help because Kennedy's journey to recovery was starting to look like a rocky road. 3 months later, Cicely sat in another hospital room watching a doctor examine Kennedy's abdomen. She barely recognized her daughter's body anymore. Kennedy looked skeletal and frail, having lost more than 30 pounds in the past few months, and none of the doctors they had visited so far could figure out why. Now, Kennedy had stopped testing positive for the strep bacteria, but her other symptoms like sore throat, swollen lips, fevers, and various mysterious aches, those hadn't gone away. But worst of all the symptoms were the sores in Kennedy's mouth. They had only grown more painful and more sensitive until Kennedy finally just stopped being able to eat. Cicely had even asked Tamara to make her famous homemade chicken soup, which had always been Kennedy's favorite food, but the sores still hurt too much for her to even finish a small cup of it. And so day after day, Cicely watched her daughter get thinner and weaker until finally it got so bad that Kennedy had to stop going to school. She just didn't have the strength to make it through the day without going to bed. But not seeing her friends really only deepened Kennedy's depression. Cicely took Kennedy to every doctor and every specialist around Memphis, but they were all mystified by what could be causing her symptoms. And so today's appointment was for an ultrasound to try to get a clearer picture of Kennedy's organs. As the doctor moved the ultrasound wand along Kennedy's body, searching for anything unusual, Kennedy suddenly cried out in pain. She told the doctor that the area he had just touched felt like a knife was going into her side. The doctor quickly wheeled the ultrasound machine closer to Kennedy's bedside and then turned the screen so Cicely could see what he was seeing. Cicely couldn't quite tell what she was looking at on the screen since the image was grainy and pixelated, but the doctor kept his eyes glued to one spot as he carefully moved the wand up and down on Kennedy's body. Eventually, the doctor set the wand down, wiped the gel off of Kennedy's belly from the ultrasound machine, and pulled off his gloves. He told Cicely that what he'd just seen on the ultrasound was very worrisome. Kennedy's spleen looked very enlarged. Since the spleen is what filters blood and fights off infections, when it's not functioning properly, then the whole body is extremely vulnerable. Not only that, but most causes of an enlarged spleen are serious, from infections to anemia, and even to certain cancers like leukemia, which affects the blood and bones. The doctor apologized for not having better news, but it looked likely that Kennedy was up against something pretty severe. Cicely didn't even know how to react. She looked over at her poor daughter, who looked so small and defenseless lying on the bed, and she just couldn't understand why all these horrible things were happening to such a sweet and innocent girl. And so once the doctor left, Cicely pulled out her phone and hatched a new plan. It was time to stop waiting for a miracle. Days later, Kennedy's godmother, Tamara, knocked on the door of the Odom family home. Tamara took her role as godmother very seriously, and she, like Cicely, had been worried sick throughout Kennedy's ordeal. Tonight, Cicely had invited her over to discuss the whole situation and try to do some research. When Cicely opened the door, Tamara pulled her in for a big hug. She could see the stress all over Cicely's face. Tamara couldn't even imagine what it would be like to have one of her own children go through something this harrowing and sort of being helpless to stop it. Once inside the house, Tamara went ahead and poured 2 big glasses of wine and then followed Cicely to her computer. The women took turns searching medical forums for descriptions of cases that were similar to Kennedy's, but they didn't find anything that matched. And so eventually, Tamara asked Cicely to walk her through every detail of Kennedy's recent doctor's appointments while she made notes of everything. Tamara had a feeling that there had to be some clue staring them right in the face about what was going on with Kennedy. She just didn't know what it was yet. And so, before leaving, Tamara just told Cicely that she wanted to go wish Kennedy goodnight. And so she walked down the hall, knocked softly on Kennedy's door, and then went in and took a seat on the edge of her goddaughter's bed. And when she looked down at Kennedy, she was disturbed at how thin she looked. The girl used to be such a vibrant teenager, but now she was like a shell of herself. And then Tamara told Kennedy that as soon as her appetite came back, she would cook her a whole buffet of her favorite foods to try to put some meat back on her bones. Now, Tamara didn't say that to be a joke, but Kennedy sort of laughed and cracked a smile when she said it. But as Kennedy did, with her mouth wide open in full view of Tamara, suddenly a light bulb went off in Tamara's head. She didn't know how she would prove this, but she thought if she was right about her theory about Kennedy, it would explain everything. Tamara kissed Kennedy on the forehead and tucked her back in, and then slipped out the door to go share her new theory with Cicely. Now, Cicely was skeptical. To her, the idea was too obvious to be true. She found it impossible to believe that all of Kennedy's doctors would have overlooked something so simple. Tamara agreed with Cicely that it could be a long shot, but given all that Kennedy had gone through already, they owed it to her to follow every lead. And so Cicely nodded, thanked her friend, and told Tamara she'd do some more research. Weeks later, Cicely got a call from the hospital. They told her that a specialist had been assigned to Kennedy's case, a Dr. Mitchell Godat. When Dr. Godat had heard about Tamara's new theory that she had learned after looking at her goddaughter's mouth, it gave him an idea. He thought Kennedy's enlarged spleen indicated an allergic reaction, so he asked Cicely to bring Kennedy back to the hospital so they could test different allergens on her skin. And that hospital visit would accomplish what none of the others had been able to do: isolating the cause of Kennedy's symptoms. And the cause had been staring them all in the face since day one. When the doctors told Cicely, she was speechless. Once again, Tamara had been right. That night in Kennedy's bedroom, when Kennedy had sort of laughed at Tamara talking about putting meat in her bones, well, Tamara had looked down and noticed the girl's braces were reflecting in the light of the bedside lamp, which made her wonder, what if Kennedy's braces were the issue? And so Tamara had suggested this to Cicely, and then after Tamara went home that night, Cicely thought back and realized that all of Kennedy's health problems began after her daughter's braces were put in. And she also remembered that every time Kennedy had her braces tightened, she would complain of intense pain in her mouth, and the pain seemed to only get worse as time went on. Cicely had mentioned this to Kennedy's orthodontist the first time it happened, but he told her that for some kids, braces are far more uncomfortable than for others, and it really was nothing to worry about. But in fact, it was something to worry about. It turned out Kennedy was allergic to nickel, which is what her braces were made of. It was the strep infection that finally pushed things over the edge. The allergy didn't give her strep throat, but the two problems combined caused Kennedy's immune system to begin attacking her body and making her much, much sicker. That's when she started getting the headaches, the sores, and everything else. Dr. Godat told Cicely that her daughter's symptoms would have only worsened and intensified if they had not identified her nickel allergy. Left untreated, her condition could have even turned fatal. Cicely was overcome with relief. Right away, she took Kennedy to the orthodontist and got her braces removed, and within hours, Kennedy began feeling better. And soon, she would make a full recovery. One dusty summer afternoon in 2013, a man named John Lee sighed with relief as he pulled his Jeep into the driveway of his family's home in Australia. John and his family had been on a very nice weekend getaway into the outback to camp and hunt, but the whole drive back home had been an absolute horror show. His 8-year-old son Mason would not stop fidgeting and talking and fighting with his siblings, and so it made the already very long drive back home feel twice as long. The second John turned off the car, Mason flung the door open and sprinted off. John looked over at his wife, Patty, and they shared a look of absolute exhaustion. Mason had always been hyperactive, but lately his crazy energy had really ramped up. His siblings basically tolerated it, but sometimes even they seemed overwhelmed by Mason's frantic dash from one thing to the next. John got out and opened up the trunk and began unloading the car, while Patty took the kids inside. Inside the garage, John stacked the family's tents and sleeping bags in big storage tubs, and then placed his shotgun and ammunition in a standing gun rack. Finally, he carefully packed the wild geese that he'd killed into an industrial-sized freezer. He would pluck and prepare them later for future family dinners. Once everything was packed away, John went inside the house, where his wife was in the kitchen putting away food. Patty asked him if Mason was with him, but John told her that he had assumed the boy was inside with her. Patty stopped unpacking and shot John a worried look. It was never a good sign when neither of them knew what Mason was up to. John left the kitchen to go find out what sort of hyperactive mischief his son had gotten into this time. And he could hear the destruction even before he saw it. He found Mason holding a hammer, completely destroying his playhouse. And so as John stood there, shocked, surveying the wreckage, he realized this couldn't wait any longer. Mason needed professional help. Later that week, John sat next to his son in the lobby of a pediatrician's office, waiting for Mason's appointment. And as they waited, Mason wouldn't stop ripping the leaves off of potted plants, and so John just handed him a magazine to tear apart instead. When the receptionist finally called for them, John and Mason followed a nurse down a hall and into an examination room. Once Mason's pediatrician, who was named Dr. Stephen Thomas, walked into the room, John explained that Mason had been acting strangely lately. The way he played had turned aggressive. He was now breaking his siblings' toys and riding his bike right through the neighbors' gardens. And so now John said, he and his wife were overwhelmed and they were worried that there might be something medically wrong with Mason. Dr. Thomas nodded and said he would order some blood tests. Then he asked Mason to sit on the examination table while a nurse came in and drew a few vials of his blood. And so while that was happening, the doctor asked John what Mason's daily life was like. What did he eat? What did he like to do? John told him the family ate a very balanced diet, including some wild game, and Mason lived a very active outdoor life, exploring the neighborhood, swimming, and playing with friends. And until recently, John said, his son had been a very normal boy. The doctor jotted down some notes and then told them to go get some lunch and come back in the afternoon when Mason's blood work would be ready. A couple hours later, John and Mason came back to the same examination room, and not long after, Dr. Thomas entered carrying printouts of Mason's results, and he told John he had some worrying news. He said Mason's blood contained dangerously elevated levels of lead. The doctor explained that lead poisoning can have very serious consequences, especially in children. High levels of lead in the blood can cause permanent mental disabilities. It can also lead to hyperactive behavior and the very kind of violent outbursts that Mason had been having. John was speechless. He couldn't imagine where or how Mason could be coming into that much contact with a toxic heavy metal. John immediately wondered if this meant his other children were also lead poisoned. Dr. Thomas asked John if their house was older, because if it was possible there was lead in the house paint. He also asked John if they maybe had some old toys or old heirlooms in the house, because those too could have lead in them. John racked his brain picturing his son's room, but all of his son's toys and furniture were all fairly new. And then also, John knew that paint used to contain high levels of lead, but their home had been built after the Australian government had cracked down on lead paint in the 1970s, and so John knew his house was safe. And so after telling the doctor this, the doctor just told John that it was extremely important that he find out where the lead was coming from and to take action to stop the exposure. And so John said he would talk it over with his wife and see what they could figure out. Early the next week, John returned home from running errands to find Patty inside of Mason's bedroom. And Mason was curled up in a ball in his bed, saying that there was a stabbing pain in his gut that wouldn't stop. Patty told John that she had given Mason tea and some fizzy water, thinking it might help settle his stomach, but neither had helped. John couldn't bear to hear his son whimper and moan like this. The boy seemed to be in far more pain than just a normal stomach ache. So John just told Patty he was going to take Mason back to the doctor. Then he scooped Mason up in his arms, wrapped him in a blanket, and carried him out to the car. At the clinic, the receptionist waved John and Mason through to see Dr. Thomas immediately. John explained that his son had suddenly developed severe stomach pains, and so the doctor immediately sent Mason to get his stomach x-rayed. 20 minutes later, Dr. Thomas pulled up the x-rays on the computer inside of Mason's exam room. John stared at the black and white picture of his son's ribcage and his spine, and towards the bottom of the x-ray, in the middle of Mason's gut, was a scattering of small white circles. But John had no idea what they were. The doctor lowered his voice and told John he couldn't identify the quarter-inch wide objects in the x-ray either, but there were a lot of them. They were definitely metallic, and they were lodged in the lower right side of Mason's abdomen. He told John that at some point Mason must have swallowed these things, and then somehow they had gotten stuck in his intestines rather than just passing through. The doctor suspected that these objects were the things causing Mason's abdominal distress. Dr. Thomas walked over to Mason's bed and pulled up a stool and sat down, and then he asked Mason if he'd eaten anything strange recently, maybe on a dare from friends. John watched as his son opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but then Mason stopped. And then Mason just shook his head and told the doctor that nope, he couldn't think of anything like that. Dr. Thomas shrugged and gave Mason a gentle pat on the leg, and then he stood up and pulled John to the side of the room. He told John that the most important thing here was for these objects to be removed immediately. They could be responsible for the lead in his system, and the longer they stayed in Mason's body, the higher the risk that they would begin to poison Mason or cause a bowel obstruction. John was feeling totally overwhelmed, but he just asked the doctor, what are the next steps then? Dr. Thomas didn't hesitate. He said Mason would need a medical-grade enema to clean his digestive tract. This was guaranteed to flush out any foreign objects. Dr. Thomas had actually already referred Mason's case to another doctor, Dr. Joseph Malouf, who would supervise the procedure. Dr. Thomas promised John that it would be quick and not at all painful for Mason. He would just feel very full. John and Patty could even be there to hold their son's hand throughout the whole thing. A couple hours later, Dr. Malouf went to his computer and opened an X-ray image of Mason's body that was taken after the intestinal flush. And the second he saw it, his jaw dropped. None of those metallic objects had even moved. They were all still right there in Mason's gut, the same as before. Dr. Malouf zoomed into the image and studied the cluster of round objects. The fact that the flush hadn't worked actually got him thinking. All Mason's doctors had presumed that Mason had swallowed these little balls, and therefore they must be lodged in his digestive tract. But the boy's digestive tract was now entirely empty, so these things couldn't be in his intestines. So where were they? An idea slowly began to take shape inside of Dr. Malouf's mind. It didn't really make sense, but it was possible, and if his hunch was right, it would explain everything. However, Dr. Malouf realized that his idea was pretty risky. To find out if his idea was right, Mason would have to undergo abdominal surgery. But if they did nothing, then these metal objects could wreak havoc in Mason's body. And so Dr. Malouf weighed the risks and decided there really wasn't any more time to waste. They would go forward with the surgery. It was the best and frankly only thing they could do. Days later, a surgeon carefully made an incision into Mason's abdomen. He was glad to see that the boy's organs looked normal, with no inflammation or visible infections. Using the X-ray images as his guide, the surgeon delicately isolated a small organ from the right side of Mason's gut, Mason's appendix. And as soon as he cut the organ free and he lifted it up with his forceps, he knew this was it. The appendix was much heavier than it should have been. Setting the organ down on a tray, the surgeon slowly sliced into the tissue and struck metal. Then it happened again and again. He realized that Dr. Malouf's hunch was right. By the time the surgeon was done dissecting Mason's appendix, he had discovered 57 lead pellets. While the surgeon stitched Mason back up, Dr. Malouf took one of the pellets into the waiting room and showed it to John and Patty. John instantly recognized it. He used those small lead pellets in his shotgun to hunt wild geese, which he would then cook and feed to his family. Once Mason recovered from his surgery, Dr. Maloof asked him, why didn't you tell anyone that you were eating your father's ammunition? Mason was embarrassed, but he explained that he and his siblings played a game where they would race to see who could make the most pellets disappear the fastest. And he did it by eating handfuls of these lead pellets. And the reason Mason hadn't said anything was he was worried his father would get mad at him if he found out, so he kept it a secret. Tests revealed that Mason's siblings had also been eating shotgun pellets, and so they too had elevated levels of lead in their body. And so, just like Mason, they all also underwent a bowel flushing procedure. Yet only Mason's pellets had gotten stuck in his appendix. The other children had simply passed the shotgun pellets in their bowel movements. Dr. Maloof was mystified by how the pellets got stuck inside of Mason. Occasionally, certain foods, like the seeds of small fruit, will bypass the intestines and get lodged in the appendix, but it's highly uncommon. For something the size of a lead pellet to end up there made no sense, and for it to happen 57 times really defied all logic. Dr. Maloof never did figure it out, but fortunately, Mason still made a full recovery, and gradually his lead levels decreased back to normal. But Dr. Maloof urged John to keep a closer eye on his ammunition, and to switch to pellets not made with the poisonous metal. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior